Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the International Center, Goa. Uh, Today's talk is by Annie Gowen, who is the India Bureau Chief of the Washington Post. And it's mostly based on a study that the Washington Post did in April, if I remember correctly, on the surplus men in India and China. In India, to the extent of 37 million more men than women. This is the 2011 census. So we are probably looking at early 40s by 2021. And in China, the numbers were 34 million. And it's for different reasons that you have many more men than women in these two very large, populous countries. And the Washington Post study was actually, I mean, as Annie was telling me, it's based, or it was inspired by a book edited by IIT Delhi-based sociologist, Ravinder Kaur. And before that, there was a New York Times study, I think 2012 or 13, which related the growing violence against women to surplus men. Let me quickly take you through the timeline, so to say, of this particular theme. It was sometime in the late 80s, early 90s that people started to write on and with alarm about the skewed gender ratio in India and China. In China, because of the one-child policy. In India, because of a clear preference for sons. The issue was framed mostly in terms of gender inequality and for women's groups and for concerned policymakers, it was simply an imbalance between the number of men and number of women. In 2002, a controversial article published in a leading leading security studies journal called International Security related this growing imbalance, the surplus men, to matters of war and peace. I mean, a nation's security depends on both internal and external security. So if you have growing social conflict within countries, whether it's ethnic, whether some other kind, whether due to growing inequalities, growing poverty, etc., then it becomes a matter of concern. It could be because, for example, the Jammu and Kashmir issue, or in India's northeast, because of the borders with China and with Pakistan. In this case, the two researchers, Valerie Hudson and her colleague, they tied this surplus, the idea of surplus men, they brought in the idea of many more men. So the old problem was somewhat reframed, I think. It was still the same problem, which was reframed in a different way. And it was tied to matters of war and peace. While I was going through this topic, I also came across an old movie which I had seen way back when it was released, which is, I think it's a movie which everyone must see. It was made by a young filmmaker at that time, all of 25 years old, Manish Jha. Matrabhumi, if you haven't seen the movie, watch it. It's violent, it's uncomfortable, and it hits you in your face. It is about a fictionary village, an imaginary village in India's future, where there are no women in that particular village. And then one fine day, the father with his two sons stumbles upon a woman in the forest and convinces the father that, the girl's father, that the woman should be married to one of his two sons. Watch the movie. So that was another way of addressing the issue through this particular movie. What happens if you have many more men, or you reach a point where there are no women? This is in fact, Annie told me that this is the book which sort of inspired the Washington Post study, edited by a sociologist, anthropologist based at IIT Delhi, Ravinder Kaur. There are two of them actually, as I found out yesterday. There's one who is at IIT Delhi, and there's one somebody else. I tweeted this, and the one who's not the editor of this book got back saying that, oh, I'm not the one who edited this book. It is the one, the Ravinder Kaur at IIT Delhi. Anyway, so this is another book which is on India and China again, and it looks at the consequences of having too many men. A bit about Annie Gowen, and Annie has been reporting from South Asia, I imagine Southeast Asia as well, and the Middle East. before taking charge as the bureau chief of the Washington Post in New Delhi. And the Post, as we all know, there are two big newspapers, the New York Times and the Post. And to my mind, the New York Times does a pretty bad job of covering India. I mean, that's my general impression. There are good stories, of course. There are occasionally good stories, but most of the time I get a sense that, and this is over 20 years, 20 plus years of reading the New York Times as an international student in North America, and then as a faculty member, and then back here. The Washington Post has not covered India as much in the past, but now there is far better coverage. I think it's better in so many ways than the New York Times. It's more fair, so to say. It covers the good, bad, the ugly, all of it. And the New York Times tends to be more focused on the bad and the ugly. That's a general impression. I could be completely wrong. Somebody who does research on the kind of coverage that these two newspapers have done over the last 10 years could come to completely different conclusions. But that's the general impression that I have. With these words, Annie, welcome to the International Center Goa, and I think the audience will really enjoy this talk.
So thanks for everybody for coming. I understand there's some journalism students in the audience, so feel free if you want during the question period to ask me about general topics about journalism or the Post and how we cover. Obviously, we don't just cover India. Most of our work right now is covering our crazy president. But anyway, so I'm happy to speak about generally about journalism. But I'm going to read you a couple of the. So essentially, what happened was that we 2 years ago decided to embark on a story about. What was the consequences of gender imbalance in China and India. And so a lot of work has been done on the why this female feticide actually exists and what are the causes of it. But not a lot has yet been done on what, there's these guys running around now, this demographic bulge is starting to appear, and what is happening with these two populations of men on the ground in these two countries, and how is it changing life? And we found that it was making very profound changes at the village level, across society in different spheres, from anything from, the way men's roles in the village were changing, men having to learn to cook for themselves for the first time, to in China where young men are now furiously saving money and building houses because they're, desperately trying to attract brides. So, okay, it's fine. So, I want to show you a couple graphics here. Well, first I'm going to read you the intro to the story, just because I think it says it pretty succinctly. Nothing like this has happened in human history. A combination of cultural preferences, government decree, and modern medical technology in the world's two largest countries has created a gender imbalance on a continental scale. Men outnumber women by 70 million in China and India. In China, for example, the population is 1.4 billion. There are nearly 34 million more men than males than females, which is the equivalent of the entire population of Poland. And they'll never find wives or very rarely have sex. China's one-child policy, which was in effect from 1979 to 2015, was a huge factor in creating this imbalance, as millions of people were determined that their child should be a son. And in India, which is actually the part I know more intimately, obviously India has had a preference for sons and male heirs for centuries, and there's 37 million excess males, and the number of female babies to the ratio of female babies to male babies has continued to plummet, despite some growing awareness programs and the government trying to speak out against female feticide, and then the problem obviously causes obviously there's a marriage gap these men can't find partners, and there's a concern that this will exacerbate human trafficking, which is already a problem in both countries. And there's also a debate about whether or not it's impacting public safety and impacting the crime rate. So I'll just show you one of these graphics, which is kind of interesting. So you can see here that, that this is the demographic bulge that was created in both countries. Between you see it rising in the 80s and 90s. So what happened, of course, in China was that one-child policy was put in place by the government, and then you had the selective sonogram technology becoming widespread in Indian villages, and that sort of created a parallel problem where it created this false demographic bulge here, which you see on the slide. I'll show you, like there, and it looks like it might be narrowing, as this graphic is telling us, but actually, this is what it will be going forward in the coming years. And this is showing the impact of the marriage squeeze. So what the marriage squeeze is the demographic, the fact that these men, as they age, won't be able to find partners, and the numbers on that are actually astounding. So Christophe Guillemoto, who's a demographer from France, said that it's about 40 million men between 2020 and 2080 in India won't be able to find wives, and 32 million men in China between 2020 and 2080 won't be able to find men. So this is quite an amazing number, actually. So of course I did this study. I did this in tandem with Simon Denyer, who is my colleague he's now the Tokyo bureau chief, but when we worked together, he was the India bureau chief, and he was the Beijing bureau chief, and we worked together on this project. And so he spent a lot of time in China meeting with these bachelors, and I spent a lot of time in India meeting with the bachelors in Haryana mostly. So here's a young man that we met who lives in this very small place in a factory town in China and never really talked to a girl, didn't think he was going to have any prospects of ever meeting anyone. And hold on, I'll just move into I don't know where these, okay, the graphic is. So an interesting phenomenon in China that has to do with the marriage squeeze is the impact on the savings rate. So essentially what happens in China, which is different than what happens in India, is that the families actually pay what's called a bride price, which is like a reverse of Indian dowry. So the groom's parents actually pay it to the bride's family, and it's been traditionally given. But years ago it was, say, $100, and now it's $10,000 that they have to save because the women are so scarce, right? So, and they're so desperate to find one. So they actually, some sociologists in China actually studied this, and they feel their contention was that you can see the impact of so this is where the bubble was the worst, right, in the 2000s. So this is where really, this one child, the impact of it started growing, and there were all these boys that were, becoming in marriageable age, and the parents had to sock away so much money for the bride price that it actually, and their contention was that it impacted the national savings rate, and in turn impacted the economy, which is really interesting because there was less consumption and people were saving more money. And so what Simon found was another interesting thing Simon found when he was in China was, so there was a lot of, I don't know if you guys had seen this, but there was a lot of press a couple years ago about these bachelor villages where there were no women and all these bachelors lived. Well, actually what Simon found when we actually started going to ground on this was that the men had actually also left the villages and migrated to factory towns to get better jobs, obviously, for the savings purposes. So the villages were actually not bachelor villages, they were empty villages. But the other interesting thing was that these boys were all trying to build houses in their villages to attract brides to one day hopes of moving and settling and being married and returning to their farmland. And so we met a lot of aspirational, hopeful men that were desperately trying to save money and build houses. So I guess that was what they were saying was if you're looking for a bachelor in China, if you're looking at someone, if you're trying to find bachelors in China, just look for the folks that are building houses. So that was interesting because there was so much attention on these bachelor villages, but actually when we really started looking into it, it was not like that at all, and it had already evolved into this other situation where these men are. So this is the national. So I'm just going to show you the bride price. So this is the bride price. It's just showing you the bride price in different villages, or different provinces, I guess, of China, where how the money that the groom's family had been giving the brides, it has increased exponentially. So of course. I think we were talking about before we started about, of course, the bride price is one thing. That's a deal between two families or a broker, and what they're also doing is bringing brides in from other countries, of course. So there's a huge population of Cambodian women who've come to China to marry these men. There's actually you can go on tour buses in Russia and Ukraine. Chinese men go take tours to Russia and Ukraine on these organized buses to look for brides, and Russian brides are very highly in demand because of their pale skin and their eye shape and all that. And then there's all these websites that are devoted to finding brides, Vietnamese brides, etc. And that does work. And we interviewed a couple actually that had met this way, and she was from Cambodia, and he had purchased her for $15,000, but arranged the marriage for that price. But she was very happy actually, or claimed to be, and they had 2 kids and everything, and she had been sort of talked into it by a marriage broker in Cambodia who had also promised her a job, though. And so that was one of the things that she was unhappy about, was that when she had gotten there that there was no job had materialized. But the dark side, of course, is that these deals then morph into something worse, or have the potential to morph into something worse, which is trafficking. And so I think sociologists and researchers are just trying to now see how much of human trafficking, which I think we all know is a growing problem in both countries, is impacted by this. And we did interview one woman who had been in an arranged marriage, and was abused by her husband, and it was very difficult for her to escape that arrangement. And she finally ended up returning home to Cambodia, but she had to leave her daughter behind. So that was very heartbreaking for her. So of course, there is a need, and the commerce is going to fill the need in terms of bride buying, but you have this, of course, there's always the concern that the women are being exploited, or will be further exploited by these transactions. So I personally spent a lot of time in Haryana talking to some women who were from the Northeast, and so what's happening in India, of course, is Haryana and northern India is the worst place. They call it the Bermuda Triangle for girls. So northern India has the worst male-female ratio, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. So northern India is the Bermuda Triangle for girls, and we met a lot of these women who had been brought in by the men of Haryana villages to be married, and they all came from the Northeast. So they were usually they were usually from very, very, very poor families, and their parents could not afford dowry. So when it became time to marry the girls, they looked for these bachelors in Haryana who could provide them with homes and all that without the high cost of the dowry. So what's happening in Haryana and of course in India is that the dowry in some cases is lessening. So that's good in some ways. So in some sociologists argue that what's happening in the economic impact of the too many men in China, which is negatively impacting the savings rate, is actually doing the converse in India. Because brides' families have to save less or spend less on dowry. But then the caveat on that is that dowry in India, as everybody knows probably, is a very complicated issue, and it's not so black and white here because also dowry at the same time is growing, and grooms' families in some parts of the country are demanding more money and cars and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very complicated issue, so it's not so black and white in India in terms of the economic impact. I just wanted to talk about the other sad thing, of course, is just the general sadness of these bachelors and the loneliness of these bachelors. I mean, I'm trying to find Suresh's picture now. Just give me 1 second. I'm just scrolling up to show you this. We spent a lot of time with this one meeting these bachelors. We went to these villages in Haryana. So there's one, a Chinese guy looking for love. A sad bachelor of China. So this is Suresh. So Suresh was a Haryana guy that we met, and we spent a lot of time with him. And I don't know if for you young journalists, you'll probably find if you're interviewing a bunch of guys or people, there's always usually one that's a little bit more emotive than others, and you kind of tend to focus on them because they can give you wonderful quotes. But he was just a driver in Haryana, and we really kind of focused on him because he had sort of like very poetic things to say about his plight. So for me, the saddest thing about these bachelors in the Indian villages, and we met dozens of them, was that they're probably not going to be married, and because of the traditional structure of Indian villages, they won't be dating as well. So they're sort of condemned not only to a life of not having any wife or someone to take care of them or take care of their home, but also without any chance of love or sexual relations or anything like that. So I think that's what's really sad about the bachelors in India. And I think there's a sociologist that we talked to called Prem Chowdhury, who's a Delhi researcher, and she said that one of her contentions is that farmer suicides, that's one of the reasons that drives some of these farmers to suicides is also loneliness, not just crop failure. Some of these are bachelor farmers who are just feeling like hopeless in many respects. So that's interesting. That's like something that's not necessarily, that was just her theory. It's not necessarily held up by any data as yet, but a lot of these things have yet to be researched in any deep way. So Suresh was there, and he was telling us how he once dreamt of getting married, and then finally, his family tried to find a bride for him, and it never really worked out. So he came. His little brother was able to find someone. So when his little brother got married, he kind of came to the realization that it was never going to happen for him, and he had some very sad, poignant things to say. He said, people say, you don't have a wife and child at home to care for. Why are you working so hard? He said, I laugh on the outside, but the pain that I have in my heart, only I know. He had sort of embraced, he was one of these bachelors that had sort of embraced this sort of traditionally feminine task of cooking. So he would cook for parties, and he he told us this one sad story about during the Harvest Festival last year, where his mother was delayed in another town, and so he had to make these sort of sweet pancakes for the festival on his own, and he was kind of crying over the bubbling oil that he was cooking over, knowing that he was never, he was not having a family to cook for, he'd never have a child to cook for, and it was very, very sad. His and the other thing about these guys in these villages is that when you ascend to marriage, it's kind of like a passage to adulthood for many of them. So if they don't marry, they're almost like in the circle of the family, still considered, not mature, and so they're not like kind of looped into the major group family decisions, and they're almost treated like second-class citizens. So he said that if I had a wife, there would be someone to make tea for me, to tell me when to take a bath. We don't have much value as unmarried men in this society. Everybody thinks, what problem does this man have? What is lacking in his family? What is lacking in him? And he told us that for him, the evenings were the loneliest times, and sometimes all he could do was, drink and put in a romantic movie to kind of assuage his loneliness. So it was very sad, and he was a very sweet guy. So the other thing that we looked at in India, which is another controversial kind of yet to be studied topic, was the impact of public safety on the impact of these huge numbers of married men on public safety. So there's lots of different studies that show different things about whether or not having large groups of men who are unmarried actually impacts crime or not. There's lots of differing opinions, and actually Ravinder Kaur, who was the editor of this book that inspired our project, did a study with her husband, who's Surjit Bala, who's also an economist, recently for the UN Population Fund, and they found that they couldn't find a link, actually, and they looked at the crime data in northern India and the growing the gap in the sex ratio, and they actually couldn't find a link. So it's still to be determined. Now, I personally do feel like it's an issue, and I think there's lots of public safety experts that we talk to in India that think that it is a problem, and there's even been an argument that some of these crazy mob lynchings that they've had recently over WhatsApp rumors, etc., are the result of these men who, mobs of men who aren't employed and don't have anything, they're out of control mobs, and that's fueled by some of this. But I think that there's, in this particular realm, there is a lot to be studied. So what we did was there was a study that was done in 2014 by a professor in Albany University in U.S. for the National Institutes of Health, which is our big national government research, medical research web of hospitals. And so what they determined was that they again looked at some crime data in India and reporting of harassment. So they did find a link between the rising crime rates and or the gender ratio in northern India, and whether or not a woman perceives that she's being harassed. So what we did was, and this is just one of the Indian graphics that we have. Yeah, so here's the India data, and you can see where the point where the fetal ultrasounds became widely available here. And so this is the worst of it, and then it'll go down actually after time goes on. So what we did was on the harassment issue, we ended up focusing on these girls in Haryana who they were little schoolgirls in high school there, and when they moved from, I guess, 8th grade or 9th grade to 10th grade, then they had to start walking a mile up the road to the high school. and these girls were constantly harassed by boys on the way, and so they would buzz them on motorcycles and pull on their dupattas and grab them and all kinds of things. So they got mad about it, and they sat on strike in the middle of town, and it was in the middle of May. Actually, it was very hot. It was about 45 degrees, but they refused to eat until the high school or the school system did something about this, and so that was kind of an interesting thing, and it was kind of one of the stories that we chose because it had a sort of a happy ending because the little ones prevailed, and the states. This was in Haryana, and the state education. Chief decided that he was going to add extra teachers and extra grades to their existing school, so they had no longer had to walk. But again, it was in Haryana, a place where there is a huge gender gap. Again, in one of these northern Indian states where the problem is worse. But these little girls had actually stood up for themselves, and they prevailed in their cause. So we ended the story with that one because it was kind of a positive thing. So I guess to wrap up I guess the question is, what can be done about this? I think that the general feeling is, as we said, that the problem is going to be existing for a long, long time. I'm just scrolling down to the policy part of the speech. The Modi, obviously in India, India has tried to address this in a number of different ways. Lots of government programs to pay parents, to take better care of girls, and you have the law against sex-selective abortion technology or sex-selective technologies that lead to abortion, which came into power it was signed into law in 2003, I guess. But there's a problem with that law, which bans sex-selective abortion technologies, but it's not really widely enforced, and the penalty of if you get caught, doing an illegal sonogram is only 3 years in jail or 10,000 rupees fine. So people feel that sociologists and others who are trying to combat the problem feel like that needs to be more widely enforced. And then Modi has obviously put in the Save the Girl Child, Educate the Girl Child program, which to give him credit, he did tout that in a speech at the Red Fort in 2014, I think, and then they launched this nationwide program. So I think people think that needs to be invigorated and given more money, and is not just made sure it's not just lip service. Now China has actually in the last since 2004 done its own version of that, and they've really made an impact. It's actually they have made an impact. They've lowered the ratio from higher heights to now it's 117 boys to every 100 girls, so which is kind of still amazing. But so they have actually had an impact with their program, but I think it's easier for China to put these things in place and have them work than India because of the nature of their government. But so those are the things that sociologists think needs to happen, and they also think that the bachelors themselves need greater mental health care. And there's also in China there's a growing concern that there's going to be many elderly bachelors who are in poor rural areas that won't have anybody to care for them in their old age, and they don't have the same as in India. There's not like an aging facilities as there are in say the U.S. So there's a big concern that these bachelors aren't going to have the social services they need. So I think that's about all I have for you guys to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this or journalism in general.
I think a lot more research is needed to make some of these connections. You mentioned Ravinder Kaur's study and one done with Surjit Bhalla finding no connection between surplus men and growing crime. If I recall, the New York Times, when it did a piece in 2013, it made that very easy connection. I think it was a leap. I mean, unless there was more to it, but at least in print, they didn't exactly, explain how exactly the two were connected.
Yeah, I think they did. I think I agree with you on that story. There wasn't actually any kind
They
of.
just said that
It might be or
yeah,
something like this.
number of cases of violence against women, including rape. Men between a certain age were responsible. Yes, of course, but why exactly? There was no explanation why exactly it was going on. My familiarity with the whole idea of surplus men and what happens is based a bit on a book by Roger Jeffrey or Robin Jeffrey. No, Craig Jeffrey, Time Pass. Time Pass was about bunch of college kids hanging out. I mean, waiting for something to happen in their lives, and mostly men, of course. Women won't be hanging out outside in the college canteen or outside the gate of the college. Done in Meerut, again, North India, Uttar Pradesh. But the thing is, I mean, you talked about something like loneliness. Now, loneliness is clearly related to mental health. So if you're talking about millions and millions of unmarried men, uh, their mental health is going to be affected. And what are the likely consequences of this deterioration in terms of mental health? We don't know. But I think it is important that questions about, what is the likely impact of surplus men, large numbers of men again, there's an imbalance in terms of, it's more of a North Indian phenomena rather than in the West or in the South of India. You have brides being purchased from the Northeast. What is likely to be the impact of that? Growing trafficking, sex trafficking, prostitution, and so on and so forth. But these are all emerging areas for research. And since we have a fairly large number of journalism students, I expect all of you actually to be. I mean, I hope that you'll all be able to spend some time talking to Annie after the talk as well. Not too long because I have to take her out to lunch. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Just tell us your name and the institution you belong to. That always helps. And that goes for grown-ups too. If you have a question, please state your name and if you belong to any institution. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, hi. Maybe not many of them are familiar here about The Handmaid's Tale.
I know what it
it's
is.
a dystopian based,
I've read the book, but I've not seen the
series. Yeah, I've read both the book and as well as the series. So in that, they have shown how in a near future where pollution has taken over and the fertility rate has gone completely down, and women are treated as basically like prostitutes in a more religious way, and as Islamophobia, whatever it is. Do you think that's going to be a reality soon? Because it's coming there slowly.
Well, I would say that the pollution is really, I don't know about the other dystopian aspects of Handmaid's Tale. I would say no, but I would say definitely with the pollution, I think the pollution is a huge problem in India and Delhi. I live in Delhi, so it's a problem for us. I don't know. Have you read Handmaid's Tale?
Sorry?
Have you read Handmaid's Tale? Margaret Atwood? Yeah, no, I think that the dystopian aspects of women, the treatment of women, I think are certainly not what's going to happen. I mean, I think women are gaining globally in so many different ways, and that they will continue to do so. So I don't think that's going to be a problem, but. I hope this. I love the way the Modi government is taking on plastic. I think it's fantastic. Do you have a plastic ban here now? Yeah, I wish they would do the same for air quality.
Effectiveness is another issue. But
Yeah, but still, that's a step forward.
In the people that you spoke to in Haryana, did you find that the women who are brought in from the Northeast Are they ill-treated? Are they treated the same way that, are they married to these men? Or do they give them, do they have respect? What is their status in
Yeah.
society?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I was actually going to mention that in my speech, and so I'm glad you brought it up. But yeah, so the women, so the issue of the women that are brought in from other places is that they are not treated as the same way as a local bride would be. They're often a different. They often speak a different language. They speak a different, there may be a different caste, and so they're often treated as kind of the lowest rung of society, and so that's a huge problem for them. The women we met were not trafficked, like they had gone willingly, or at least their families had made the deal willingly, but they complained about, for example, they having to work in the fields where the husband just sat and drank, and physical abuse as well. So that's a huge problem, and because they're outside of their own, obviously they're away from their own social support network, and they're a little bit isolated. I mean, a lot of the women do come in groups, so like one will come and then she'll bring another one, and all that. So they do have some kind of the women that I met were mostly from Tripura. And so they did have that kind of social network, but there were some that just wanted to go, they were just going to leave and go back. But then they have kids, and the kids are not, the families don't want the kids to go. So they have to leave, they have to make the difficult decision, as the woman from Cambodia did that I spoke about in the discussion, was to leave the child behind. So yeah, but it's a good question. And yeah, that's a problem.
I would like to ask you, how do you compare the women of China? How are they doing compared to the women in India?
Well, do you mean in terms of the gender gap, or just generally?
Gender gap because of the government policies, and now as improvement of life quality of women.
Well, as I said, I think I think women in India are gaining, by leaps and bounds. I think I've been talking to. Talking about some education statistics, which are really amazing, actually. The women are completely taking over, and in some cases, in the master's degree programs, exceeding the males in colleges. Yes, that's the concern, right? So in higher ed, for example, they're doing fantastic, and then you have this conundrum, then, of course, about, and maybe Dr. Pushkar can speak to this. I'm not an expert in why Indian women are leaving the labor force, but then you have this problem where they're not getting jobs, and then they're leaving the workforce in large numbers. So I think that's a conundrum, and I think the jobs question overall in India is a huge problem. So and I think I did a different series earlier in my time here about the way that the patriarchy is still so entrenched that it's difficult for women, even if they want to get ahead. I mean, I did, the land laws, for example, are, technically there is a Hindu Succession Act which helps women to take over property, but in fact it doesn't help in many cases. I mean, I did a story about a woman who was very evolved, and she'd left her village in Bhopal and moved to Delhi and had the Delhi lifestyle, and she worked at the American Embassy School, and she kept going back home to try and preserve this property where the uncle was encroaching on this property, and finally he just killed her. And so it was a very tragic story about a modern woman who was, against all odds, was fighting for what was right for her and right for her family, and she was, the patriarchy was so entrenched in that area that he just felt like he had the right to kill her. So I do think you have that. I think that's the big challenge for Indian women. On one hand, you have all the society growing at such a rapid pace. The economy is booming. There's opportunities. More and more women in the villages have cell phones and even smartphones, and their husbands are actually allowing them to use them. And so there's more and more opportunities, but there's still some structures in society that keep holding them back in some ways.
All I know is that the percentage share of women in the workforce is dropping.
Yeah.
That is something which is emerged, and it's happening even as more and more women are getting, completing the school and education and the college degrees and so on, and yet the share of the workforce is declining. And in in most modern societies, what you see is over a period of time, the percentage share of women working goes up. In India, it's actually declined. So that's become a big area of concern.
Yeah, and I don't think they really know exactly. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, there's lots of theories as to why that is. I mean, I think one of the interesting theories is that when middle class families say arrives, so they move from the kind of family that would have a scooter and a rental property to having a home, some kind of a home and a little car. When they arrive at that income level, then then it's almost like a rite of pride that the woman no longer has to work or no longer has to take to the fields. That they're able to have that sort of traditional lifestyle, and that's, I think, one of the pressures and one of the interesting pressures about that phenomenon.
Also, labor market bias. Women are going to have children, so labor laws are also such, or hiring practices are such where it discriminates against women, irrespective of their education.
You find that patriarchy still plays a very big role in India. Is it also so in China? Is patriarchy a predominant player in China still, with all the advances and laws they have?
I mean, I think they have a very different social system than India's. I mean, so I think it plays out a lot differently there, But I'm not an expert in China, so I know a lot more about how women work in India.
Ma'am, I would like to know what is the problems women go through when they are in the journalism industry, or what is women's share? What is women's share in the journalism industry
Well, I mean, in India or just generally?
generally?
I was at a forum last week in Delhi about journalism in India, the Media Rumble, and I was just amazed at there was a women's panel, and there was a woman who got up in the audience afterwards, and she was talking really about how there were all these evolved women on this panel and very successful, CNBC anchors and all, but the woman got up in the audience and she's like, you don't understand what it's like when you're trying to be a woman journalist in a small town in India. She was essentially saying that these Delhi women just really had no idea how difficult it was, in the sense of the boss would make rude comments and they'd be harassed when they went and tried to do interviews, and it just sounded like very difficult work at that level, and that was I found really interesting. I was going to say one more thing about that. Oh, and then there was a woman from not Times of India, but Indian Express, who was saying that there were women in her office that are actually harassed outside the office. And so they have to do this whole thing constantly with the staff there. Are you okay? Is anything happened today? Which I just found to be like kind of amazing. So even in Delhi, actually, as well, they were having problems. So I think that's a difficulty in India. I think generally speaking, around the world, you would say women do not have pay parity to their male corresponding salaries. For example, we did a study of our own newsroom where everybody, but all the white males make 20% more than everybody else. That means black males, that means Latino males, that means Hispanic males, and then all the women. So that's even in our newsroom, it's the same thing. And in our masthead, we don't have any women. So the women editors, all of the sections of our, which I think is horrible, by the way. So sports, foreign, metro, national, all the important sections of the paper have white male editors, and the only one that has a woman editor is this sort of style section, the female, which would be the traditional female bastion. So these things exist even now, even in all across the world. These challenges.
My name is Gloan. So my question to you was, you had mentioned how the government of India pays girl parents to take better care of their daughters, and also they've banned female feticide. Could you tell me more about the government of China doing something? about this issue?
So I know again I know more about the India side of it. I mean I know that Indian states have had many different programs over the years where they've incentivized parents with money actually, and not just in northern India but also Tamil Nadu to take better care of their girl children, feed them better, educate them better, and these programs have had a variety of efficacy. So there's not really, I think it's really difficult. I mean, I think some sociologists would say, obviously, if you look at the gender gap opening up here, getting worse here, that these programs are not helping. What has been one thing that's kind of been interesting in China, which is not necessarily they have a very strong national policy, so that's what's helping change things in China, which they put in place in 2006 to address this, and so they actually have had an impact, and it's a wide range of things. But one thing that they're actually in terms of payments, what they're actually thinking of doing is getting a pension for the parents. So the parents, they'll have an old age pension, so they won't have to worry necessarily about having a son to take care of them when they're elderly. So they would have this money, they would know that they would have a pension in place. So that would help ameliorate this desire to only have a boy. So I thought that's kind of an interesting thing that they're talking about doing. And I think they're actually doing it in some places.
Yeah, I also had another question. Other than, I think you mentioned depression from being in solitude, like not married. Is there any other health issues these men face because of being, like not married or something like that?
Well, I think the depression is the biggest one, and I think what's really, really interesting is I'm the child of a psychotherapist in the U.S., and my mom is a working counselor, and so we have a pretty strong mental health system in the U.S. And what's interesting to me in India is that counseling and therapy and group therapy and talking about your problems is really not traditionally been a big thing. And I think marriage counseling, for example, is very nascent, right, in the country. And so there's no mental health for these guys at all. There's nothing. There's no support at all. And that's what's sad. What I think is super sad, because there's obviously not financial support, but even if they wanted to, even if they were brave enough to say I need help, which is not really something I think that would happen in any case, there wouldn't be any program for them. I mean, Haryana has nothing for these men. Nothing, like no counseling services or anything. Except, I'm sorry, there are a few NGOs though that work with the population, so they do have that. They do have some of that kind of. We focused on Haryana because it was the most acute. So the whole idea of the project was to kind of look and see what's happening on the ground, and so because these men are only just becoming adults, so the feticide really worsened in the 80s, right? So the men are only now just reaching adulthood. So the worst area, of course, is Haryana, Punjab, and UP, that sort of triangle area. So that's why we focused on Haryana.
Annie, this question's for you. One side, we were saying that there are so many men who are not going to find a bride. And the other side, we have almost every day we hear about rape and murder. So it's like use and throw or eliminate. Did you do any little more research on this side? I mean, can that psyche, when there are too many, they hardly get a woman, and when they get one, they rape and murder? Finish.
Well, I think I've actually done a lot of work on this, actually, and not just in conjunction with this particular series, but as I said, I did this the 2 years before I did this study about why patriarchy is so entrenched in India, even when, but it's very, very difficult. I mean, one of the most surprising thing that's ever happened to me in 20 years in journalism happened in this village in Delhi, Chhatarpur, in Chhatarpur area of Delhi, because I was doing this project, and so we set out to find out what was, everybody says that what's going to change this is gender education. So you need to have these gender violence classes and education for men to realize, what they were taught as a child or what they might have seen other men do is not right. And so it's gender education is what's needed. So I went to this gender violence class in this village where this NGO was working, and they had gathered the men to talk to them about about how gender issues is how do you treat women, etc. And we kept saying, where's the head of this class? Where's the head lady? And her name was Zatinya or something like this. And we couldn't, and she was never around. And they kept saying, oh, she's on leave and all. Well, it turned out that she had killed her daughter-in-law. It's crazy. She'd killed her daughter-in-law and over a fight with the son, and she and the husband had ganged up on her, and it was a bride burning kind of a thing. And she had absconded out of the village. And so here was this woman that was supposed to be teaching, the men how to be good men and how to, and you still had this very violent, thing. And I don't think it was. I'm not saying it was like an example of all villages, but it was still. It shows you like how as you would say this throwaway mentality is still there, so
Women need to be taught, or the little girls need to be taught. The women are the ones who are going to bring up the little boys, whether when they're good or bad. They're also going to bring up the girls.
yeah.
If they are bringing up boys to be the kind human beings that she would like to have as a husband.
Yeah.
And the girls also to be brought up thinking that they can do anything and everything, and they're not just confined to the girly things.
Yeah. Well, I do agree though that it needs to be taught in the schools, and it needs to be every school has to have some kind of curriculum around this. But I think in India there's also a big littering. There's issues. I mean, just for example, when I was a young person growing up in the 70s in America, we had lots of litter and pollution and all that kind of stuff. But when we were young, there was constantly these messages on TV about give a hoot, don't pollute, and there was like an American Indian crying by a littered stream, and I vividly remember these messages we would constantly get about protecting the environment. And I think that and smoking too. So when I was coming up, even when I was a young journalist, people in America still smoked, but the school kids are now taught about how bad that is. And so it just takes it's a generation of change, right? So I think that there's a growing awareness in India that these things need to be taught and expressed to kids. And I think it'll take generations to change, but it will. I think it will come. Hopefully. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
In a macro sense, my name is Lakshman Padmanani. I'm an immigrant from London. In a macro sense.
An immigrant from where?
Thank you.
And you said you're an immigrant from where?
I'm an immigrant from London.
Oh, London. Okay.
Sorry. In a macro sense, do you feel that we could be helped a lot more if the politicians at the top set us an example by giving more opportunities for women to be leaders, to be perceived as leaders, you see? If you look at the composition of the present cabinet, for example, it's not exactly over-provided with women, you see? Now, many years ago in England, we had the same problem. And it was Tony Blair, for the first time, this is about 20 years ago, when he became prime minister, he encouraged, at the time of the elections, he encouraged a lot of women to become members of parliament. And I remember at that time, we had something like 70 women who entered parliament. And I think that one of the reasons why, if you come across an English woman today and compare her to an Indian woman, you can see the difference. She's a lot more confident for that reason. And
yeah,
do
I
you think our politicians could be setting an example?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the women's reservation bill is an issue in Parliament. You know, I mean, why won't they pass that? You know, I mean, I think women do think that there should be that, and I think also at the village level, I think in panchayats, you know, there's a requirement that I think village-wide that the panchayat needs to have a percentage of women on it, but sometimes it's a woman that's put on there by her husband, and the husband is actually pulling the strings behind the scenes. There's a guy named Gilles Vernier, I think, at Ashoka University, who's looking at this from India-wide, and he was telling me recently, he's a professor at Ashoka, was telling me that, you know, there's like, he's looking at the state parliament, so the MLAs, how many are women, and like Nagaland has no women at all in the state parliament or the state legislature. So that's interesting, and I agree with you. I think that, you know, more needs. I mean, I think that, you know.
See, people like Modi, for example, you know, saying that he's, somebody over here made the point about female feet being, you know, made illegal. That's fine, but unless you set an example at the very top and push women forward, you know, positive discrimination, if you like. Yeah. Unless you do that, you're not going to be able to lead a change in the mindset. And I think the problem in India is the mindset. And if you want to alter it, you have to lead by example. Have more women in the damn cabinet.
Yeah, but, well, I mean, he does have women in the cabinet, Sushma and Nirmala, and yeah, there's some. I mean, but it's not, you're right, it's heavily weighted towards men. But he does have some prominent women in his defense. Right?
Reservation for women. Because there's reservations for everybody.
I mean, we have this woman, Mrs. Irani, but I mean, she went up. I mean, we really don't have them.
Yeah.
And if you don't have women giving, we had a leading banker, you know, and she's unfortunately, you know, fallen by the wayside. You know, when you get that, you're not going to be able to change the mindset.
Yeah.
And I think it takes the leaders of corporations, of politics, and top bureaucrats in the government. They are the ones who've got to set the examples and actively try to, like Martin Luther King did in America with the civil rights movement. You've got to take active steps to change the mindset, and you can't do it without example.
Yeah. But I mean, it's the same thing in America. I mean, Trump hardly has any women cabinet members, you know, and most of them, ones he does have are rich men, you know, millionaires, you know, rich white men millionaires.
I'm Saloni, and I just have one observation and one simplistic suggestion. The observation was that right through the talk, the tone was on the findings which reflected the elderly guys are feeling lonely because they're looking for a woman to take care of them. The younger men are, looking for cooking kind of women, so their loneliness is coming from the fact. So all the tone and tenor was throughout, I thought, coming from that women are still expected to do the gender roles, the typical gender roles. And I thought it's a fantastic, simplistic, but fantastic opportunity. Instead of giving men the violence training and controlling their whatever else, to just make themselves so wooable. You know, learn the cooking, learn the caring, so that the role reversals happen, and women are attracted towards you. They are scarce, pay the value. Price yourself high. Economics and gender will all get balanced.
Yeah. In a perfect world, right?
See, one of the things that doesn't get discussed, and maybe given the times that we live in, is that if you have so many surplus men, millions, in a political system such as ours, there are millions of them who can be mobilized by political leaders to particular ends. So one could possibly, and this is just a loose hypothesis, I mean, I haven't done any work on this, I haven't read much on the subject, but whether it is the United States, the emergence, the triumph of the right, so to say, in the U.S. In India, again, growing violence, etc. I mean, I don't know what the connection is, but there is possibly a connection. So rather than cook, they would either be engaged, they would more likely to be engaged in time pass or doing useful things like, other useful things.
No, it's just that even in India, when men retire, the typical thing is their identity is so closely woven with the work and the male kind of interests, etc., that they are at a loss. Women transition easily. So I'm just saying, I mean, I know this guy he does everything so seamlessly that it's a pleasure to have that kind of person. And then you don't get into this, then there's no shattering of glass ceilings and all these mega concepts. You're doing it by example, as you said, but not at the political, but at the micro level. Then it percolates upwards rather than downwards.
But I mean, with
Simplistic, I know,
but a lot of these men, I mean, I know a lot of Indian men who are just as evolved as men. I mean, men elsewhere. I mean, where they're in their 20s and 30s and they're helping with the kids, and it's they're more of partners with their spouses than So I think it's changed a lot, actually.
So in this research, did you come across women who were, since it was a rural area and scarcity of women, did you come across cases where women were getting shared by family members?
I read about that, but it was very difficult to find. I mean, there is a sociologist who believes that happens. It's actually something that has happened in India for many years, but that somehow this new phenomenon of the gender imbalance worsening was making that happen in Punjab, etc. But we weren't ever able to find any real people that was happening to.
But
yeah. Right. Yes. So it was right. You're exactly right, ladies. Yes. So we knew it was there, and but skulking around and finding somebody so would actually speak to us is just it was just way too difficult. So
that's the whole problem, because the women from outside, they are not respected,
right,
and they have nobody to turn to. Mm-hmm. So they are fair game for everyone.
Yeah.
That's a tragic reality.
Right.
The movie that I mentioned at the beginning, Matrabhumi, it gets down to that. Father and two sons share. So, but that's a movie.
But I mean, there's actually some. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but there's actually a long ancient tradition of this in like Himachal, I guess, or somewhere like that, and also Punjab. But right. So, but yeah. But in terms of it actually happening on the ground now in Punjab and actually finding a family where it happened and actually having the woman be allowed to speak about it was really beyond what we could do. So, but when we talked about this at the office, that they were interested in it, but it was just impossible to find.
Hi. So I have this question on, you did your research in Haryana and places in the north mostly. So did you come across many cases on pedophilia? Like if yes, what do you think, is it more in China or is it more in India?
More cases of what?
Pedophilia, like child abuse.
Oh, we didn't actually look at pedophilia in this particular study. And so I don't know what the comparison would be with China and India. I mean, I know it's a growing issue in India, or people are talking about it more. So the numbers are rising, but I don't know about. We didn't look at that aspect for this piece.
Hello, I had a question. Will the men be in surplus in the future, or will the gap between men and women be decreased?
Yeah, so the projection would be that as the population grows, the fertility rate will continue to decrease, so that people will continue having less kids. But over time, they expect the gap to continue to widen for the next 2 or 3 decades, and then to narrow going forward. So it's going to be a problem for some time, actually.
In US, I think I've heard that women are incarcerated for self-defense also if they suppose they commit they kill the person who was harming them. Does that happen in India as well? Women are jailed for that in self-defense?
So in America, you can actually kill someone in self-defense and often not be criminally prosecuted. But I'm not sure how, I don't know about how Indian laws work on that, actually. Sorry. That was not another thing that we didn't look at. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the same thing in both countries.
My name is Sulochna and I'm from Goa University. I just wanted to know whether there was any comparison between married and unmarried men regarding you mentioned about the depression cases. Like you're single and you're facing depression. And in connection to also family planning measures. Like we have now one child norm policy. Like we are encouraging more people to have only one child instead of now 2 children. So now you stop with one male child because strong son preference in the society.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the implications you think regarding the family planning measures when we talk about men?
Well, I think that I think the number, as I said, I do know that the number of children has the fertility rates have decreased in India and China, but yet in India the population, of course, is going to overtake China in as soon as 2020, right, or fairly soon. So I think that the family planning measures that China have taken has been more effective than what India has taken. But I think that the one-child policy, what one-child policy in China showed was that just makes the problem worse. And I think that's why they decided to rescind it in 2015. Because even though they were taking these steps starting in 2006. To care and protect girls, and as a national policy, they realized that with having this law was going to continue to make the problem worse. So I think that's the lesson, right? So they've walked away from that.
Last couple of questions, if there are any. Okay, we are done. My time for thank yous. ICG members, I see a few. Thank you all for coming. Few members of the media who are here. We have students and teachers from the Department of Media and Journalism, Don Bosco College in Panjim and St. Xavier's College, Mapsa. I see some. These are all college uniforms, right? Okay. We also have faculty and students from the Goa University's Department of Women's Studies, Goa College of Home Science. We had a question from someone there. Once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Annie, for taking time to be here at the International Center Goa. And not your first visit to Goa, right?
No, yes, no, it's not.
Okay. Okay, thank you all.